Good morning. Welcome, everyone. This is the Agroforestry in Action webinar series. My name is Gregory Ormsby-Mori. I'm the Education and Outreach Coordinator for the Center for Agroforestry at the University of Missouri. Our guest today is Eric Toensmeier. Eric, can you hear us?
Yes.
Thank you and welcome, Eric. Eric Toensmeier is, I'll give a little introduction here before we start the webinar. And then the presentation is going to run about 45 minutes, 45 minutes, after which we'll have a question and answer session. And both the remote online audience as well as our in-person audience is welcome to present some questions. So the total length will be about an hour, and unless we run over with some additional discussion. Once again, this is the Agroforestry in Action webinar series. You can see this recorded webinar of today's presentation and all previous webinars on our agroforestryinaction.org website. And you can learn more about the Center for Agroforestry at centerforagroforestry.org. Let's welcome our guest. Eric Toensmeier is the award-winning author of Paradise Lot and Perennial Vegetables. He's also the co-author of Edible Forest Gardens. Eric is an appointed lecturer at Yale University, a senior fellow with Project Drawdown, and he's also an international trainer, and he regularly presents in both English and Spanish throughout the United States, Canada, Mexico, and the Caribbean, as well as Guatemala. Eric has studied useful perennial plants and their roles in agroforestry systems for over 2 decades. He cultivates about 300 species in his urban garden at his home location, and if I can attest to, it's quite a fascinating site. An incredible amount being done on a very small urban site. His writings can be viewed online at perennialsolutions.org. In his new book, The Carbon Farming Solution, Eric Toensmeier argues that agriculture, specifically carbon farming, or practices known as carbon farming, should be at the center of a global climate solutions platform. The book is available, and you can read more about it at carbonfarmingsolutions.com. Carbon farming is a suite of agricultural practices and crops that sequester carbon in the soil and above ground biomass. It can take many forms, and we'll hear about that today, some of those details in Eric's presentations. By far, agroforestry practices and perennial crops present the best opportunities for carbon sequestration. These are win-win carbon farming practices, some of which are already widely implemented around the globe. But they offer huge potential that's been largely overlooked or ignored by climate crusaders. The carbon farming solution at its root is a toolkit. Eric's ultimate goal is to place carbon farming firmly in the center of the climate solutions platform, along with renewable energy, such as solar and wind. And he aims to change the discussion, to impact policy decisions, and to steer mitigation funds into the research projects and to people around the world who, using these carbon farming strategies, can play an important role in this really an unprecedented challenges we face with greenhouse gas emissions and climate change. So let us please welcome our speaker, Eric Toensmeier.
Great. Well, good morning, everyone, or whatever time it is, wherever in the world you may be. And a special welcome to, I guess there's a whole room full of folks in France, I believe, and a room in Mexico as well. So welcome to all of you and those of you from everywhere else. Let's see. So we'll be talking about, this is sort of a very brief overview of we'll talk about the sort of the big picture of carbon farming and the types of practices and their potential impact and some of their co-benefits. We'll talk a little bit about the types of practices, and then we'll also discuss perennial staple crops. This is a Center for Agroforestry presentation, and it happens that almost all of the most powerful practices for sequestering carbon are agroforestry, so it seemed to fit very well into what our hosts have been doing, and I'm very grateful to be here. And Thanks to Gregory and everybody for having me out today. Um, so let's see the very brief framework that I'm operating from around climate change. Is that in order to mitigate climate change to a level that's really conducive and friendly to civilization, we want to return to about 350 parts per million of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. That's the organization 350.org is based around that notion. And to do that, we have to do two things. One is we have to very, very drastically reduce emissions. But also we have to remove a bunch of the surplus of carbon dioxide and store it somewhere safely. And we have to store somewhere between 200 and 250 billion tons or gigatons of carbon, which is a fair amount. And this really entails transforming every aspect of civilization, transportation, industry, buildings, regional planning, as well as agriculture. So we'll be talking about just one small piece of that today. Let's see, in the definition of carbon farming, lots of different people have different definitions. Everyone agrees that it's a suite of practices that sequester carbon, and we'll talk a little bit about how that works in a minute. And some people's definition requires that those farmers are being paid for providing that service, whereas other people feel that it would be nice if that was happening, but it's not essential. What's really clear to me is that whether or not you include the financial incentives in the definition, there's no way we're going to have the scale of impact that's necessary without those financial incentives being provided. And a lot of these practices are already practiced on a large scale. Many of them have been practiced for thousands of years. Some of them are already being practiced on hundreds of millions of hectares around the world. Others are very new, and some are still under development or somewhat hypothetical. And these range from practice on a very, very large scale, large mechanized farms, down to a very small microtype scale. And the basics of how it works. You may remember biology class where during photosynthesis, plants take carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and they convert it into different kinds of carbon compounds, usually built around sugar in their tissues. Like plant fibers, for example, are typically made of long chains of glucose, which is a sugar. Now, right away, within an hour, a lot of that actually is exuded through the roots to feed soil microbes, but a lot of it stays in the biomass of the plant as long as that plant remains alive. And over time, a bunch of it becomes available. About a third of it becomes available, decomposes into the soil, whether through root hair, dieback, or falling leaves, and becomes organic matter in the soil. And organic matter is about 57% carbon. And biomass, above ground biomass, is about 50% carbon on a dry weight basis. So there's carbon in the perennial vegetation above ground, and there's carbon in the soil. So we're looking not only at the carbon that's sequestered, but also at the other kinds of benefits. First, we're looking at some at the ecosystem level, benefits to biodiversity. Some of these kinds of systems, like the tropical home garden, has been shown to have the highest level of biodiversity of any human-created ecosystem. So we can talk about, in some cases, high levels of biodiversity and a number of other kinds of impacts. One that's particularly important is reversing desertification. Desertification is a type of degradation where lands lose a huge amount of their stored carbon in their soil and vegetation through the process of degradation. We have benefits also on the farm directly. First, when you increase soil organic matter, which essentially all of these practices do, you're, for example, you're creating an improved water storage in the soil, which helps to get through dry seasons or droughts more effectively. And as we'll see, there are some impressive benefits to yields, to adaptation to climate change. That is, as the climate gets more difficult to farm in many places, some of these practices help to make it continue to be possible to do so. And then we have some benefits to the to people, really, and that can be whether it's from direct income, increased access to food or income, which can lead to increased access to food. In particular, we see some benefits to women, like a great reduction in the areas where firewood is still the primary cooking fuel. We see a great reduction in the number of hours required to collect firewood because people are able to collect it right on the farm as sort of a byproduct of their agroforestry system. And we also see some interesting impacts on climate justice and climate debt, carbon debt, which I think we'll see in a moment. Yes, okay. Climate justice is this phenomenon where we have where responsibility for climate change largely lies with wealthy nations and wealthy individuals, and yet the impacts are largely felt in the global south and by the poorest people within any given country. So we're looking for strategies to mitigate climate change that also address climate justice at the same time. And as it happens, this is a particularly excellent strategy for doing that because as it happens, we'll see that perennial crops are among the most powerful strategies, and most of the best yielding perennial crops are tropical. Most of the practices that sequester the most carbon are most widespread in the tropics, and some of them still are not yet ready to be practiced outside of the tropics. They're still experimental. And in terms of albedo, which is about the how dark or light the surface of the earth is, trees way up in boreal regions like in northern Canada and Norway and stuff, evergreen trees there actually warm the planet more than they cool it by sequestering carbon because they're dark, and they in the winter when there's snow on the ground, they change it from a very light surface that reflects heat to a dark surface that absorbs it. This impact is felt the least in the tropics. So these are all very strong arguments for the potential of these kinds of farming to play the potential of funding these kinds of farming as a real impact on addressing climate justice, which to me is a very exciting example of the multiple functions and co-benefits that come from this kind of farming. Okay, so that was a little very brief introduction. Basically, these are kinds of practices and a range of perennial crops that can help us to fight climate change and to provide a number of other benefits to people and farms and to the environment. The next set of these that I want to look at is a suite of practices here, and we'll sort of look. We'll look at a range of these. We're not going to cover all of them. I cover maybe 40 broad practices in the book, and often they're combined and recombined with each other in different ways. So we'll do just a very brief passing over this range of practices. The first thing to note here is that not all practices are equal when it comes to carbon sequestration. So first, we're looking in this slide at the annual rate of carbon sequestration. That is how much carbon is sequestered each year in metric tons per hectare per year. And we can see different practices ranging from a very low sequestration of under a half a ton all the way up to 50 tons per hectare per year. So you can see there's a huge range in the amount of carbon sequestered between practices and also within practices. There are so many variables in colder climates. You tend to get less in biomass and more in soil, whereas the opposite is true in tropical climates. In drier climates, you tend to have less sequestration because there's less water to drive photosynthesis. So it's not possible yet to say that a given practice is going to sequester a given amount in a particular soil and climate and mix of species and so on, but we can look at these general trends here. And one of the trends that we see is that the more trees are incorporated, the more carbon is sequestered. And that's sort of good news for those of us who are enthusiastic about agroforestry and perennial crops, which are already a good idea to do anyway. The other thing to note about these sequestration rates, we'll handle questions at the end. The colors show very low is blue. I do see one question there. Very low is blue, low is green, medium is light green, high is yellow, very high is orange, and red means extremely high, and that relates to the amount of tons per hectare per year sequestered, as you can see the little numbers along the top of the chart there. And these rates continue for somewhere between 10 and 50 years, at which point they more or less stop because the soils become saturated with carbon, and sometimes the above ground biomass also sort of slows down and fills up what's going to happen there. So these are not rates that continue forever. They continue at this rate and then they slow dramatically. They sort of slow to a trickle at that point. So generally speaking, practices with more trees do better, although there are individual data points that I don't show on here that are very high or very low for many of these. The second piece is we want to look at not the annual rate, but the lifetime stock. That is the lifetime amount of carbon that's stored more permanently in the soil. And this particular slide is looking at the rates of sequestration in soil and not looking at the above ground biomass. And again, these are in tons per hectare lifetime. And they range from 50 or less. A lot of them, any of them can be low. But nobody is presenting rates for conservation agriculture, for example, higher than 50 tons. And most of the grazing systems are doing under 100 tons. But when you start to add trees again with tree intercropping systems, with silvopasture systems and multi-strata systems, you start to see higher and higher levels of carbon stored in the soil. We also see that these systems can greatly improve yields. And that's one of the things that we're really interested in terms of food security, in terms of reducing deforestation, in terms of clearing land for additional farming. We're looking to grow more food on the land that we have. And here you can see that some examples of a number of systems that increase the yield. Sometimes we're looking at an increase, like with windbreaks, for example, you're putting in a protective system that improves the yield of the grain, annual grain grown alongside it. Sometimes we're looking at increases in the yield of livestock. So in some cases, the perennial carbon sequestering component of these systems is sequestering carbon while supporting those crops, and in some cases it is the crop itself or one of the crops itself. So we have both supportive and protective systems on the one hand and actual perennial intercrops on the other. Okay, annual cropping systems. This is the first category, and on the one hand we have systems just for growing annual crops better. And we also have systems here where a perennial element is incorporated. For example, I'm showcasing too, you can see on the bottom left there some of the examples of types of systems for improved annuals alone in the little white box, and then systems that include trees and perennials. So I won't be touching on all these, but I'll be highlighting two of them here. First, conservation agriculture. When we look at the sequestration rate, conservation agriculture is a system that involves reduced tillage, cover crops, and crop rotations. And sometimes that's done on a smaller scale in an organic way, and sometimes that's done on a very large scale. Mostly it's done on a very large scale as an herbicide-based system, which I'm less enthusiastic about. But we do have some good data on it, which is that the sequestration rates are very modest when compared with tree intercropping systems, which these are global averages of sequestration rates. The tree systems tend to do quite a bit better. The lifetime carbon stocks are also quite a bit better in the tree cropping system. Both have positive impacts on yields. Both are done on a large scale around the world. And agroforestry systems tend to be somewhat more expensive to implement. And I'm not trying to say by doing these different comparisons that there is one best or right or only way to do this. However, whenever possible, if we can do the thing that sequesters more carbon, that's going to have more mitigation impact, and often it has more of these other co-benefits as well. So it's really, I'm trying to present a toolkit that communities and farmers can use to determine which are the right tools for them. That is, I'm not providing a prescription, but just offering a palette for people to choose from. So that's a little bit about annual cropping systems. Then we have livestock production systems. The first one is managed grazing systems, and there's a whole range of these. Some are very ancient, like the Alhima grazing system that goes back 1,400 years on the Arabian Peninsula. It also might include things like modifying stocking rates, different kinds of burning, all the way up to the holistic grazing system, which is seems to me to be something that has is likely to have a much higher rates of carbon sequestration. Although really the numbers are scientific numbers, broad global averages for that don't really exist. I've read Teague's articles and a few other things. We have individual data points again, but we don't really have the data for a wide global average, which we do with these other practices. Managed grazing, again, quite low in terms of the annual rate of sequestration. However, it can be done in a lot of places where you can't do anything else. In dry grasslands where that's all you can do, it's really a very nice choice. However, anywhere you can add trees to a pasture, the numbers are quite clear that both the annual rates of sequestration are higher, and also the stocks are quite a bit higher. Yield impacts from managed grazing can be higher or can be lower, because sometimes you're actually reducing heavily overstocked areas. Generally, I think it's going to be higher, but there's certainly cases where it's lower. Silvopasture globally has about a 7% increase, not intensive silvopasture, which is much, much, much higher. And globally, managed grazing is practiced on 12 million hectares or more. It's very hard to find data. And silvopasture, 450 million hectares. It's really a major global practice. So there are a range of other practices in here as well. The next category is perennial cropping systems, and this could include first the perennial monoculture type systems, and also multi-strata systems where you might have multiple layers of trees with shrubs underneath and herbs and so on. They're more diverse, they're more complex, they can be much more challenging to manage, but their carbon sequestration is really outstanding. They really represent the highest recorded levels of carbon sequestration. So our rates are much, that global average is about 3.5 tons per hectare per year for perennial crops. Multi-strata systems range enormously, and this here is an expert estimation from P.K. Nair, the great Dr. P.K. Nair, but even he has to provide a very wide range. It's so variable. And the carbon stocks, the maximum recorded soil stocks under multi-strata systems, are the highest that we've seen. These are both practiced on a wide scale, 100 million hectares or more around the world. So these perennial cropping systems are quite really one of the most powerful tools that we have. And now here we have, I have sort of a grab bag of additional kinds of tools. Some of them are ecosystem management tools. Like looking at some of the traditional and indigenous land management around the world, like some of the Swidden systems in the Maya region, for example, or traditional indigenous management in Australia and California in the United States, for example. And then we're also looking at some infrastructure and amendments, things like rainwater harvesting, terracing, keyline, and use of tools like biochar. So first we're looking here at sequestration rates. Rainwater harvesting has a global average of about 1 ton per hectare per year, and it sequesters carbon because it makes more water available, which makes more photosynthesis possible. Biochar rates, it just depends how much you apply. So if you apply a little bit, it'll do a little bit, and if you apply a whole lot, it'll do a lot more. Um, we're missing data on carbon stocks. Certainly, rainwater harvesting increases yields, and biochar actually is found globally. The global average is about a 15% increase in yield. No one seems to know exactly how much of the world is practicing rainwater harvesting, except people agree that it's widespread and traditional in dry areas. And right now, biochar, its current use is at a pretty small scale, although there's certainly historic use in the Amazon, in the Maya regions of Central America and Mexico, and also some evidence for traditional use in Africa. Rainwater harvesting can be very inexpensive or very, very expensive, and biochar is less. So the real limiting factor on biochar is the amount of biomass available. It's kind of like biofuels. There's just only so much available, and to really get, if you were to only have biochar be our strategy, we wouldn't have land left to eat. So it's really something that's a tool and a part of the solution, but not a silver bullet. It's been a little oversold sometimes as a silver bullet to climate change. So those were our categories of practices. We have annuals alone, improved annuals alone. We have annuals with perennials. We have improved grazing alone, and we have grazing with trees. And we have perennial crops alone and perennial crops and polycultures. And then we have our infrastructure amendments and productive ecosystem management. That's the set of tools in the toolkit. And one of the things I really learned working on the book is that while we know a lot about the perennial fruits of the world, and we know some about the perennial vegetables of the world, most of the world's farmland isn't growing fruits and vegetables. It's growing basic staple crops, the protein, carbohydrates, and fats. Rice and wheat and corn and potatoes and soybeans and things like that. And also some industrial crops, which we won't touch on here, but I do look in the book quite extensively at perennial crops for materials, chemicals, and the small amount of energy that they can provide us. And in particular, the role of those things in replacing the hefty percentage of petroleum that goes into producing materials like plastics and synthetic rubber, and as feedstocks for the chemical industry. So to return to staple crops, this is a really big deal. It's a huge use of the world's land, and a third of those staple crops are used to feed livestock, which is pretty interesting and highly problematic. So suffice it to say that my proposal around livestock is that we would cease feeding annual crops to livestock, and feed them either on food waste and crop residues in the case of animals like pigs and poultry, and primarily with grazing and fodder trees for ruminants. So I've taken a look at these kinds of staple crops and found that there's really you can classify them or break them down. First, we have the based on their percentages of oil and protein. So there's basic starch crops that have less than 5% of protein or oil. There's balanced carbohydrates that have intermediate levels of protein and or oil. Some that are high in protein and low in oil. Some are high in oil and low in protein, and some that are high in both protein and oil. So we'll walk through very briefly and look at each of these pieces. I found it's very challenging to compare these perennial crops with annual crops. We want to be able to say, well, which perennial crops are ready to actually substitute for or replace to some degree annual crops, even if it's only for feeding livestock. Yields seem to be the best way to do that. I'm not necessarily advocating growing these things in monocultures, but the best way to compare yields is to look at on a per hectare basis. And first I've removed the inedible portions, so that might be like the pit and skin of an avocado is inedible, so I'm not including those. I see a few people are having static. Should I wait a minute and see if people can hear all right?
Yeah, we're getting, Eric, a whole lot of static there. It seems to have subsided now. Let's see if we can try to get him. Maybe it was a mobile phone or something interfering. It seems to have gone. Let's try to keep going.
Okay, okay, great. I've removed the inedible portion of crops, like again, avocados,
Eric, it seems to be
seeds.
coming from your side. So I'm talking
Okay,
now.
let's see. I'll shut down my phone, see if that's causing any trouble.
No, it seems to be something with your microphone.
What's the microphone?
Yeah, yeah, your microphone or your feed from your microphone. Things are clean when I'm talking. It's just static.
All right, any better now?
No.
How about I try with the phone? Is that any better?
I'm not getting any stat. Can you speak again, please?
Is that any better?
It
Yeah,
is.
I'm seeing yeses from people. Okay, well, we'll do without the microphone then. Okay. So we're looking again at removing the inedible portion of these perennial crops and then calculating them on a dry weight basis because there's a lot of water in a banana, for example, and it's not fair to compare that with corn without really drying them out. Just as an example, here's a comparison of the yields of some of those balanced carbohydrate crops that have between 6 and 15% of protein and or oil. The ones that are in blue are annuals, and the ones that are in black are perennials. And I've been able to find for some of them an average global yield. And for others, I have just a range of yields in terms of tons per hectare. And that is, again, on a dry weight edible portion only. And we can see that there are indeed perennial crops that yield very competitively with annual crops, although that is generally true only in the tropics and not yet in temperate climates. For example, we can see chestnut all the way on the bottom here. Chestnuts can yield up to 5 tons per hectare per year, but when you remove the shell and dry them out, they have a somewhat lower yield, so they're not producing as well, for example, as wheat or potatoes might. Although they have lots of other benefits and they're very nutritious and they're very delicious and they're a great product for farmers to grow. And when integrated in an agroforestry system, I'm sure they can out yield a monoculture of other things just fine, or if they're integrated with those. But this is just to say that there are certainly perennial crops, perennial staple crops that can yield competitively when compared with their annual competition. And this is true for the other categories that we're not looking at, for protein and for protein oil and for oil and for basic starch and so on. So we do have good, strong, competitive perennials. So let's just look at each of these categories briefly, and we'll look at a few sample species. We have these basic starch crops, things like sweet potatoes, taro, and cassava. And the global perennials, this sort of globally traded perennials in this category would be bananas and plantains that we know and love. One example is the breadfruit, which is very, very impressive yields and is really an all-round fantastic perennial staple crop. It could be much more widely grown outside of Asia. We really have yet to see it come up to its full potential in the humid tropics. And there's a great number of traditional agroforestry systems throughout the Pacific that feature this species. Our next category is these balanced carbohydrate crops. This would be things like corn and wheat and potatoes and rice. These are really the most widely grown crops in the world. Wheat is the #1 most widely grown crop in the whole world. And our global crops, our globally traded commodities in this category would be chestnuts and carob. These have between 6 and 15% either oil or protein or both. And the example to look at here is the mesquite, a desert crop. There are actually mesquites native all over the world, but the ones that are best to eat hail from the Americas. Our tropical American mesquites, some of them have amazing yields. We estimate a global that they're likely to yield around 9 tons per hectare per year on a dry weight basis, but we do have recorded yields as high as almost 50 tons per hectare per year, which is really, really extraordinary production. We can compare that again to the um, uh, maximum one we have recorded here for corn at 18 tons per hectare per year. So certainly this is a species that has very impressive potential. It's also a really important species for firewood, for charcoal, and for livestock fodder. So certainly something that with a lot of potential. And there are also um, very cold hardy mesquites that can handle. Some of them grow in the United States into southern Colorado and Kansas, for example. So they can handle, some of them, a very impressive amount of cold, and some of them grow at extremely high elevations in the tropics as well. And there are some traditional agroforestry systems with mesquite also. Our next category is protein crops. These are high in protein and lower in oil. Things like beans and chickpeas, cowpeas would be examples of globally grown ones. And there are really no globally traded perennial protein sources. The pigeon pea would be a partial exception in that pigeon peas are perennial, but they only really yield well in the first year. There are, however, perennial varieties of pigeon pea, which do yield well for 4 or 5 years. Those don't seem to be the ones that are being globally traded, however. So, my favorite example of a perennial protein crop is the Chacha Fruto. It's a tree bean from the Andes. It grows in the highlands. It's an extremely productive bean. It's actually 85% water, so the yields look very impressive, 20 or 30 tons per hectare per year. But when you dry those out, you get a much more respectable 5 tons, 2 to 5 tons, which is as good or better than you're going to see with things like regular common beans and the other commonly grown beans like chickpeas and so on. And this is a nice big sized tree. It grows um, from live stakes, so you can just cut a branch and plant it in the ground to grow a new tree. So very interesting, and part of a number of different kinds of traditional and contemporary agroforestry systems from the Andes. Something I'd really like to see much more widely grown around the world in tropical highland climates. Then we have the protein oil crops. These would be the bacon cheeseburgers of the vegetable world, of the botanical world. Analogs to soybeans and peanuts and sunflowers. And I should mention that there are perennial analogs underway for things like rice um, and sunflowers, and wheat and so on. And most of those are really not yet ready for commercial production with consistent high yields for multiple years. The one exception to that is perennial rice. Right now, in its fourth year of trials in China, we're seeing very, very impressive yields year after year after year with a newly developed variety of perennial rice. So it looks like that's going to be the first big productive, high yielding perennial grain out of the gate. And people have been working on that since the 1970s. So it makes sense with all that lead time and with a good budget that we've got that happening. In terms of some of the global perennials, there are a number of global perennials traded in this category, as you can see there, including things like walnuts and pistachios and almonds. And actually, the highest yielding, as far as I can tell, as far as I've been able to determine, the highest yielding protein oil crop in the world is the almond, yielding higher even than soybeans. Very, very impressive. And that's in the very intensive kind of systems you see in California. The global average is much more modest. But it's nice for me to see something that grows in a colder climate able to do something. And even here in Massachusetts, we have some almond varieties like Hall's Hardy that produce very well here. So it's primarily limited to Mediterranean climates, but in some tropical highlands, in some warm temperate, and even in some cold temperate climates, you can see almond production. Let's see. Then we have oil crops, mostly high in oil, and that includes both things that are eaten as oily fruits and nuts like macadamia or avocado, or pecan or coconut, and also things from which oil is pressed. So the pressed oil annual analogs would be things like safflower oil and canola. And our global perennials, as you can see, the avocado, the olive, the coconut, really some very delicious and marvelous crops. Our example here, I wanted to give an example for cold and dry climates. This is the sea buckthorn or sea berry, um, which I really went and looked at really all of the world's or close to all of the world's cultivated fruits, to see which ones were high in oil and protein. And this was really the only one I found for cold climates, that's legitimately high in oil and or protein. In this case, it's high in oil. It's primarily grown as a fruit crop. And when you dehydrate that, you're getting about 2 or 3 tons per hectare per year of fruit. Um, but up to 800 kilos per hectare of oil, which is really competitive with some of the other oil crops like sunflowers and so on. So while this is not really grown as an oil crop on a large scale today, it has potential for cold climates, for cold and dry regions, as a real perennial staple oil crop. Uh, yes, so let's talk about barriers for farmers just for a moment. Um, there are so many challenges that face a farmer who's looking to do this for any of these practices, even if you're just transitioning from conventional to organic, which does increase your carbon sequestration, all the way up to implementing more complicated agroforestry systems. You're looking at multiple years for those farmers where they're spending money and time and taking risk many years before they break even, 2 to 5 as sort of the accepted number for that. And we need to help farmers get over that hurdle. And one of the ways to do that is to provide money to farmers for doing that. An example would be low interest loans. Brazil offers low interest loans for farmers doing sustainable agriculture practices, for example. I'd love to see price premiums in a model similar to organic, where there would be carbon farming certification, and farmers would be able to receive a price premium from from consumers who have enough disposable income to do that and sort of put their money where their mouth is around climate change. And of course, some countries already provide payment for environmental services from government to farmers for carbon sequestration. And I think that's something that I'd like to see a whole lot more of. There are also a number of policy barriers in the way at the international level, at the national level, and at more regional levels. Some of those are disincentives for sustainable types of agriculture. Sometimes, for example, agroforestry falls between the cracks of agriculture departments on the one hand and forestry departments on the other hand, and is left sort of with no home to call its own. So there's a whole range of different issues, including the World Trade Organization prevents a lot of countries in the global South from providing subsidies to farmers for environmental practices, for example. So there's a whole range of things that need to change from the local to the global. And my general approach is not to wait for governments, but to go ahead and do what we can now while we continue pressure on governments for them to keep up. And finally, we were supposed to go about 45 minutes, and it's just right now on 45. So this, just to show, there's a website for the book. The book has just come out. I'm real happy with it. It's almost 500 pages long. It has great volumes of information, and it has about 2,000 footnotes. But I've gone and put a lot of things up on this website, free resources, including downloadable and searchable spreadsheets of all the different 700 species that I profile in there, the introduction to the book, a large number of videos, links to all of my favorite readings. So it provides a whole lot of information for folks to begin with, and I'll continue to put more information up there as we go. So thank you all. That was sort of a very brief whirlwind tour of, the 500 pages or the 12-week long semester long class I teach on this. I obviously skimmed over a lot of things. And I can see from the questions that have been put forward so far that people have lots of interesting things to say and lots of questions. Some of those I have good answers for, and some I don't. So I think we'll hand it over to Gregory to facilitate the selection of questions.
Well, thank you, Eric. And thanks for everyone who has participated up until now. I'm going to open up a question and answer dialogue box here, and folks can put in some questions. There were a few questions that did get put into the comment boxes. So if Eric, or any of those that jumped out at you, have at it. I'm going to go back through those comments and try to flesh some out. But as people are putting in some of their questions, Eric, maybe I'll put a question to you. Financial mechanisms and policy reforms. What are maybe could you just maybe go into a bit more detail or highlight a few of those ones that you consider sort of the top, say, policy reforms that are maybe both could have a significant impact and maybe are achievable? What are some things that if some of us wants to be active, what should we be focusing on for policy reforms? And I'll let you pick the level.
Ooh, sure. Sure. Well, I guess that depends on sort of a country by country basis, but I'll give a few case studies of places where interesting things are happening. The country of India, for example, has recently approved a policy to go from currently 25% national forest cover to 33%, all through increasing agroforestry on existing farms. So they're really working on putting together different kinds of incentives to assist farmers to add trees to their existing farms now. And that's a very ambitious and exciting project. The country of Australia has a very interesting national carbon farming program that's been in place for, I think, about 8 or 9 years now. That is a payment for environmental services model that pays farmers to implement particular practices that are known to sequester carbon. And the state of California in the United States is in the process of setting up a carbon offset program, which is not at all my favorite way to do that, but they're setting up a carbon offset program, which will include payment to farmers for carbon sequestering efforts. And they've been working very closely with the U.S. Department of Agriculture climate hubs on implementing that and setting carbon sequestration rates and so on. So that's a very interesting policy effort. Really, in the United States, the key policy issue is just to get folks in Congress to recognize that climate change actually exists and that it's problematic and that it should be a priority in our national policy at all. So it depends very much where. Whereas those of you who are visiting us from France today, the French agricultural minister is one of the world leaders on carbon farming policy and has put together this 4 for 1,000 policy where they're encouraging each country to try and have their farms increase soil organic matter by 0.4% each year. So from 1% to 1.4, and then from 1.4 to 1.8, and so on. Which, while it's, I think maybe it's not quite as simple as that. In that drier places, it's going to have to be slower, and so on. And it's ignoring above ground biomass. It's really a very exciting thing, and a number of countries have signed on to that, including Mexico. Okay, great. So I'll start to answer a few of these questions. Why is hazel not considered an oil crop? It is considered an oil crop. It's just that I didn't include all 100 oil crops in this presentation. And actually, I would consider hazelnut, I consider that to be a protein oil crop because it's, in addition to being high in oil, it's high in protein. Just like a soybean, which can be eaten as a bean that's high in protein and oil, or you can press the oil from it. And then typically the press cake that's left over is used as a livestock feed. Do I see recent trade agreements as deterrent? I haven't, to be honest, looked at these particular trade agreements in great detail, but all of the other big ones that have come down the pike have been bad. for carbon farming, and I'll assume that that's the case here too. And the most of my information on the policy stuff comes from the UN conference, UNCTAD, UN conference on trade and development, and they have a couple of really nice publications on agricultural policy and how they limit sustainable agricultural practices, which is the category that carbon farming is part of. Yes, I see agricultural cooperatives playing a positive role. I see them playing a positive role already. There's a number of examples around the world. In Brazil, there's a cooperative of agroforestry producers who are providing raw materials like rubber and castor oil and indigo and fibers for use in bio-based plastics and composite materials in the automobile industry. There's an agricultural cooperative producing turpentine in Honduras, and around the world there's lots and lots of, for example, coffee cooperatives and cacao cooperatives. And I also certainly would see a role for the for worker cooperatives in the maybe like the processing and transportation world. The model I like for that is the solidarity economy, which is coming out of Brazil, which is sort of about federations and networks of cooperatives with worker ownership, with workplace democracy, with good pay, and so that's, and also, by the way, there's a department of solidarity economy in the Brazilian government, which is providing a bunch of different kinds of loans for these businesses and other training and so on. Do I have different comments on the role of different kinds of fungi and so on? Okay, I can't read the rest of that one. Maybe I can make it bigger here. Okay, so the role of various kinds of microorganisms in carbon sequestration is interesting because on the one hand, some of them are part of the process that actually creates the long-lived soil aggregates, which are soil organic matter, which represent the carbon storage. On the other hand, effective decomposers in the soil are also breaking down carbon compounds in the soil and returning carbon dioxide to the atmosphere. So I don't have particular comments on particular kinds of microbes and their role, except to say generally it's better when there's a higher and more diverse population of them. And there are some studies that have shown that inoculation with various kinds of organisms, fungi, bacteria, and so on, can increase rates of carbon sequestration. And certainly application of compost, which is full of all kinds of organisms like that, can increase carbon sequestration, particularly in dry rangelands, dry pastures. Okay, but Aaron, I can't give you a better answer than that because I don't know. Okay, the necessary social and economic structures. Oh my goodness. Okay, again, I'm primarily a botanist, but my sort of program is I would like to see removal of the incentives for the kinds of agriculture that are causing emissions, and the creation of incentives for this kind of agriculture. Personally, my model, I prefer carbon tax over cap and trade. Cap and trade has really kind of a bad track record. The IPCC is not wildly enthusiastic about cap and trade, which are these companies, you set a limit on how much carbon can be emitted, and a company that you sell a certain amount of like licenses to pollute, and rather than cleaning up their act, a company can pay someone else to sequester an equivalent amount of carbon or reduce emissions an equivalent amount. So there's a lot of room for sort of corruption and slippage in there, but also there's usually not a reduction in the annual reduction in the amount of carbon permitted to be emitted, and thus it doesn't actually reduce emissions as rapidly as we need. It also looks to me, and I talk about this some in the book, that a lot of things about our economic system or systems are probably going to have to go, like the notion of profit above all things, like the externalization of costs. You know, I'm going to go ahead and pollute with greenhouse gases, and that's somebody else's problem. That's not part of my bottom line for my business, for my operation. And studies show that more broadly in terms of climate change, that we're not going to be able to get to the lower levels we need to regain with the levels of consumption that are present among the world's wealthier people, which would include, not just the Bill Gateses of the world, but really the world's middle class and so on. And we need in the United States, for example, to return to a level of consumption which was used in the 1970s. So I see some pretty big rethinking of economic priorities and economic structures, and also of governance. Certainly, some of our governments are not wildly functional at all, and some of them are failing to address this quickly enough. So that's sort of broad, but I guess that's my general take there. Is it's going to require some rethinking, just as we need to rethink a lot about agriculture. We need to rethink a lot about business, economics, governance, finance, and so on.
So Eric, sorry, go ahead, Eric.
And I would also
yeah. So there's more. I'm just going to remind folks in the online audience to post any questions into the Q&A dialog box so that Eric and I can see them. Eric, is there any one question there that you're in the remaining questions that you would like to address?
Okay. Oh my gosh. Well, I'll take on this livestock one because that is the biggest controversy, I think, around carbon farming is livestock. And very briefly, the reason there's controversy around livestock is partly because confined livestock are consuming annual grains at a huge rate, and annual cropping as practiced today is part of the problem with emissions from agriculture. But also because of the production of methane, and methane is produced from the manure of all livestock, but also through the digestion of ruminants, which would be like your cows, goats, and sheep type kind of livestock. It turns out that it's really hard to quantify. There's no good general rule for how much for the extent to which methane emissions counteract the sequestration of livestock systems. But I see a number of case studies where it's around 25% of the sequestration is offset. So while I do think, and I think the science is definitely pointing to, there are systems of producing livestock that have net carbon sequestration, even when you include the emissions of methane and nitrous oxide. I do think that grazing as a whole has been kind of oversold by some people as a silver bullet solution. The global average rates of grazing systems are fairly low, and some of that is offset by these methane issues. And when you do hit that saturation point, that might mean that you become a net emitter again after a certain number of decades. And it looks to me like a simple solution that is to use silvopasture wherever possible, to convert pasture to silvopasture wherever it's possible to do that. And then you're very clearly hitting the point where methane is only offsetting a very small amount of your carbon sequestration. I could add that also nitrogen fixing trees produce some nitrous oxide emissions, which is also a serious greenhouse gas. And no one is quite sure how to quantify that either. So I think that if you stop feeding annual grains to livestock and you have them in well-managed pastures and silvopastures, in terms of ruminants, where they are net sequesters of carbon, that's fine, and there's a certain amount of livestock can be eaten, but that probably still means that most people in the wealthy countries are going to eat less meat than we do today. So I'm sort of falling somewhere between the Alan Savory extreme on the one hand and the vegan extreme on the one hand. It's quite complicated, and we really don't have answers to all of it yet. And I think Savory did a little bit of a disservice by saying this is the answer to all of the world's climate problems. That's not my read of the situation, and that's not my read of the science. So I guess that's my last one right there.
Okay, Eric, thank you very much. We have, I think, come to the end of our presentation here. It's run about an hour. Our apologies to any of the remaining questions that have gone unanswered, but perhaps we can have a mechanism where these are provide these to Eric afterwards, and he can perhaps have some follow up. But Eric, thank you so much for the presentation, and it's been a very interesting and engaging presentation. Just one second here. Let me bring back to the last screen and remind folks that today's presentation has been largely a glimpse of some of the work presented in Eric's new book, The Carbon Farming Solution. And again, more information, including about the book and how to acquire the book, are available on carbonfarmingsolution.com. And as Eric mentioned, there's also a lot of other information, a lot of the references. In fact, a lot of available literature is available through that website as well. So it's definitely worth a visit to carbonfarmingsolutions.com. And with that, I'd like to once again thank our presenter, Eric Toensmeier, and thank you all for participating and being with us for the Agroforestry in Action webinar series. See you next month. Check out the Agroforestry in Action web.org for future webinars and recorded versions of previous webinars. See you next month. Thanks, everyone.